Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 6 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. This time around I have 15 new cards, because a ton of cards were just dumped, including a handful of new legendaries to talk about, so I'm going to be moving through these a little quicker than usual today, just because there are so many cards for a single video. But as usual, I will still be talking about each card at great length in the beginning portion of the video. If you don't have a ton of time and you just want to see the reveals, if you check the description below, there will be a link towards the end of the video where I do my quick hit 5-star reviews where you can just run through each card in rapid succession and just get my overall take and of course see the cards themselves. But let's go ahead and jump into the long form version of the review starting now. Up first, I want to talk about a few of the new legendaries, starting off with the third of the princes. This time it's Prince Valanar, the 4-mana version of the princess with the exact same mechanic. And even though I think the other two are fairly weak cards, somehow this one is actually the worst. Prince Valanar is a 4-mana 4/4. You can't have any 4-cost cards in your deck. And if you don't, if you satisfy that condition, you give this minion Lifesteal and Taunt. Frankly, I'm not sure that I feel like a 4-mana minion that was a taunted lifesteal 4/4 would feel particularly good on its own, even if it was just a straight vanilla card. I mean, that's kind of similar to things like Wicker Flame Burn Bristle, for instance, because it wouldn't have Divine Shield. So even when you like high roll into this condition and you build your deck and you satisfy it and you get what you want out of Prince Valanar, I think he still kind of sucks, or he's just an average card at best. So sacrificing the integrity of your deck to accomplish that makes almost zero sense to me. This card seems absolutely miserable, unplayable. I can't envision a world outside of maybe a random arena deck where, for instance, you just run a 4/4 minion, that this ever sees any kind of play. It seems just totally unsensible. I don't understand how this one makes any sense. A 4/4 taunted lifesteal minion is not good enough to sacrifice all the good 4-drop minions in the game. The only 4-drop you'd really be willing to sacrifice to run Prince Valanar is Prince Valanar. Absolutely terrible card. I totally hate it. So let's move on to another new legendary that isn't quite so bad. This time it's Moorabi, the new Shaman legendary minion. This is a 4/4, and it's another card that takes advantage of some freeze-style synergy in Shaman. With this one, whenever another minion is frozen, so whenever one becomes frozen, the wording here is actually a little bit awkward, but whenever one becomes newly frozen, you get to add a copy of that minion to your hand, and that can be both allied or enemy minions. So essentially Moorabi here, Murabi, is a card generation card, right? Like if you can freeze multiple things in a given turn with Murabi on the board, then you're adding cards to your hand. Sort of a card draw / card generation mechanism. Honestly, you can almost compare this to something like Lyra, right? Where you satisfy a condition, you get a card back in your hand. But Murabi, in my mind, is not nearly as good as a card like Lyra. Minions are perhaps better than priest spells on average, but I think his condition's a little bit harder to satisfy based on what we've seen so far. If Shaman gets some sort of Frost Nova style card that can be comboed out in a single turn with Murabi, that could be pretty powerful because it would be a board stall while developing what is otherwise a very slow value line kind of play, because Murabi himself does not impact the board immediately. He's a really slow play. He's about resource generation, not about tempo, not about influence on the board. So you have to have some sort of stall mechanic. Now, granted, freeze does do that. So building a freeze Shaman deck that's all about control, it's all about slowing down your opponents, it's about long-term value over the course of many, many turns, I do think would support Murabi. So if that is a deck that can come out and can start to make sense, this would be a card that certainly fits it very, very well, as long as the deck was slow enough, and it seems like it certainly would be. So I actually think Murabi will get some play in that kind of freeze Shaman deck. He makes sense for that archetype as we start to shape it and start to envision it, at least. Who's to say for sure if he'll end up being good enough or that deck archetype will be good enough. But I don't think this is necessarily a bad card. I think it's fine. It's not a 5-star card, but it's certainly going to be playable in those environments, and it'll be the kind of card that fits into a certain kind of deck archetype. Clearly not a fit for Shaman across the board, but a solid little card nonetheless. So now that we've seen Moorabi, I think we can talk about another freeze card being given to Shaman, and this is Cryostasis, a new 2-mana spell. It's a buff that gives a minion +3/+3, but it also freezes that minion, which is eerily similar to an effect I had in my custom cards that I made for Knights of the Frozen Throne. So basically the idea here, and as I talked about it a lot in my previous video on those custom cards, is that if you can freeze a minion, like a taunt minion, and give it a bunch of stats, the fact that you're freezing your own minions is really not that problematic, simply because it's a taunt anyway. Your opponent still has to move through those stats and is still forced to deal with that, particularly if you're not expecting the minion to survive as a taunt minion into its next turn. The fact that it's frozen won't matter. If your opponent is anticipating killing it by then, the freeze is basically free, and you're getting a pretty efficient +3/+3 buff for only 2 mana. So I like that aspect of the card. Clearly, it also synergizes with things like Murabi we just saw. You had an Earth Elemental on the board already, and you play your Murabi. If you Cryostasis your Earth Elemental, you're buffing your Giant Taunt even more, so it's harder and harder for your opponents to deal with, and you get a free Earth Elemental added to your hand. So that's a really efficient kind of play that would all start to synergize together really nicely. And then there's really the flexibility with Cryostasis too. You can actually use this on enemy minions if you're really desperate for a freeze. You just need to make sure that that minion, that giant thing your opponent has, the Bittertide Hydra or whatever, sticks around for a turn or two while you're playing into your Volcano, for instance. You can Cryostasis it, give it 11 health, make it do even more damage when you Volcano it. Now that's obviously a very specific example that's super amazingly perfect for this kind of card, but there are others too. Just anytime you need to stall out damage or stall out your opponent. If you have a Hex waiting anyway, who cares if you give it +3/+3? You really just desperately need a freezing potion, and you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of upside to accomplish that, just because that moment suits it. So it's sort of a pocket last resort freeze, but also can synergize in specific kinds of decks really nicely. So I actually think this is another solid little card, not synonymous with Shaman by any means, but in the right kind of deck can do things that you want it to do, and seems like it fits Hearthstone pretty well. So let's move on to another new legendary. This time around, it's the Mage Death Knight Hero card. We've already seen this one leaked early. I was right. It is real. Told you so for all the people out there who didn't think it was real. This is Frostless Jana, a 9-mana hero card, 5 armor, Battlecry summon a 3/6 water elemental. So for 9 mana, you really just get a 4-mana minion and a 1-mana spell with something like Ironhide, right? So it's really a pretty big tempo loss to play this 9-mana card. You're sacrificing basically 5 mana, and arguably it's even slower than that because the water elemental is so slow. The armor's not that significant, so a very risky thing to play this right off the bat. Let's just get that out of the way. Really slow card. The upside, though, is that your elementals do have lifesteal for the rest of the game, which is cool. And you get this new hero power called Icy Touch. It's still a ping, so the same ping effect as always. But if your ping kills a minion, you get to summon another water elemental. So basically, your ping gets a free 4-mana minion attached to it for the rest of the game. So clearly, when that happens, that's really, really fantastic. But I have even more problems with this card. It's not just the speed and the tempo that's an issue, because it is, again, very, very, very slow. The other issue I have here is that the elementals for Frostless Jana don't actually synergize in an elemental deck. What is the elemental condition to activate elementals? You have to play an elemental the previous turn. None of these summoning effects are actually going to ever trigger your next elemental. So you can't trigger your Servant of Calamos, you can't trigger your Blaze Callers. None of those things are going to work. Now you can still build a solid elemental deck without the triggers, right? You can still just play elementals, get the lifesteal, do all that. But again, incredibly slow. Plus, I don't really think it's that easy to line up Icy Touch plays where it summons you a water elemental every time. It's really just going to be like every other turn or every couple turns. And your opponent knows that, so they can play around your Icy Touch plays as well, making trades that would otherwise not make sense just to deny you that free water elemental. So it just feels to me like there's a lot of problems making this card all fit together. I just don't think it's going to work very well. I think it's way too slow. Way too conditional, way too specific. Lifesteal is also fairly slow. It takes a long time to build up a ton of value in my mind. So across the board, fundamentally flawed in my mind and a pretty disappointing hero card. So now let's move on to another disappointing mage card. This time around it's the Doomed Apprentice, which you'll see is basically the opposite. It's a corrupted sorcerer's apprentice. It's 3 mana though instead of 2. And instead of your spells getting cheaper, it actually makes your opponent's spells a little bit more expensive. This is similar to another effect we already saw with the Rubian Unraveler previously in the Knights of the Frozen Throne reveals. But this time it's only your opponent's spells. It's not all spells, so there's just upside here with the Doomed Apprentice. But really, unfortunately, the problem here with this card is that it just doesn't have enough stats for a 3-drop. It's really susceptible to all kinds of trades, all kinds of removals, and even when you get it on the board, a 1 mana penalty, I think, really won't make much of a difference most of the time. Yes, there are specific cards at specific points that you can counter. In the reveal video, you know, they mentioned playing this into a Warrior's turn 5 to deny them that brawl. You could play it to stop a Pyroblast. Those instances exist, but often running a couple cards in your list just to counter one specific matchup or find opportunities in a specific turn in a game aren't worth actually compromising your own strategy and what you're trying to do, particularly for a minion that in the long run only offers a very small tempo disadvantage to your opponent and doesn't really offer any value or any tempo of your own. So to me, it feels like this is a fairly weak card, just a filler card. It does a cool thing. It's got a unique effect. I'm glad they're exploring a new design space, but at the end of the day, it just won't make that big of an impact on the game. So let's move on to a card that I think will make a huge impact on the game, and that is the warrior spell Dead Man's Hand. I think this one's sort of crazy. This is a 2-mana spell that allows you to shuffle a copy of your hand into your deck. So if you have 6 cards in your hand, you play Dead Man's Hand, those 6 cards get shuffled back into your deck. If you have a Dead Man's Hand in your hand when that happens, you shuffle a Dead Man's Hand back into your deck. So essentially you have a pseudo-infinite number of cards that can continue to be added back into your deck. Most of the time, in the kinds of decks that are going to run this, which is a Control Warrior deck that's going to have a ton of card draw, by the way, I suspect you could easily have between 6 and 8 cards in your deck, or in your hand, excuse me, when you cast this card. And some of those times it's going to double up your Dead Man's Hands. So I think you're going to be able to add 6, 12, maybe even 18, those numbers of cards into your deck. So instead of a 30 card deck, you're probably going to have a 40, 45, 50 card deck if you run double Dead Man's Hands. And of course, that's perfect for a fatigue warrior already who's building tons of armor and trying to just outlast their opponents. This essentially gives warrior the infinite card options that a Jade Druid currently has. And we've said, you know, Jade Druid shuts out all other control and fatigue archetypes because it's just so good at that. Well, suddenly warrior might actually be able to go toe-to-toe with a Jade Druid, because in those Jade Druid decks, eventually what happens is, once they get down to the end of the game, they're really only able to play 1 Jade Druid per turn. But if that warrior suddenly has 5 executes and 4 brawls and 6 shield slams and all these other multiple copies of their removal cards, they're going to have enough tools to actually go toe-to-toe with Jade. Not to mention, of course, every other control deck. They're going to have 4 balls for all of the N'Zoth plays all the time. Now, clearly there's a lot of strategy and a lot of decision-making that goes into that, because you have to use your Dead Man's Hand when you have the resources in hand that you need, and you have to have those resources. You can't have already utilized them. This is not helpful at all in an aggro meta. If it's super aggressive, this card will not help you. It will just be a wasted 2 mana. Sometimes you might be able to cast it for free if you have a hand of stuff that really suits what you need. So, you know, if you have a double Ravaging Ghouls and you know you're going to need a ton of Ravaging Ghouls because you're playing like a token deck, you could still cast Dead Man's Hand and stuff your deck with more Ravaging Ghouls so you can draw into the specific kinds of cards that you need. So there's a lot of power in that, but it's still not going to be that good against faster decks. Clearly this is designed specifically for fatigue matchups, but just having, you know, 2 times as many legendary threats and big minions and multiple Cthuns, and there's all kinds of ways that this gets really crazy in those long-term, super heavy, late-game control style matchups. So I think this is going to redefine what Control Warrior looks like a little bit, and I'm really, really excited to see this. I think it's a a powerful card with lots of potential to change what the meta looks like. I don't know that it's run in every warrior. It's definitely not run in Pirate Warrior, right? But still has a lot of potential to be a high impact card in Hearthstone. So let's move on to another warrior card. This time around, it's the animated Berserker. On the opposite side of things, this is just a 1-mana minion. It's a meager 1/3 with a neat little effect. After you play a minion, deal 1 damage to it. So this is basically your Enrage setup kind of card. So as far as stats are concerned, 1/3s are pretty good for 1 mana. That's been a common stat allocation, but there's not that much upside on this one like the other strong 1-drops we've seen in the game where they tend to grow in attack value. So this is only ever going to be a 1/3, which I do think is a little bit of a problem for this card. It's just not going to trade into that many things. It's not going to have a very large impact on the board in the early game. Clearly there's some potential here to set up plays, play Acolyte of Pain after this, you get a free card draw, all those kinds of things. But often too, dealing 1 damage to your minion, as nice as it can be in a deck that's designed to take advantage of it, Grim Patrons, Armor Smiths, Acolytes, etc., etc., it's still a little bit of a problem because it takes health away from your minions, so it can restrict your plays somewhat and limit you on what you're able to do. So, although this is not a bad card by any means, it adds some interesting stuff to Warriors' arsenal, allows them to build decks in a kind of new and cool way, and just reinforces that maybe Tempo Warrior, Enrage Warrior, Whirlwind Warrior kind of package that we've seen in the past. I still don't actually think this card's going to be all that strong, or we're going to see it very often, because it's really pretty limited in what it can accomplish. And I think Warrior already has better tools and better ways to access those Whirlwinds on demand instead of putting down what at the end of the day will end up being a fairly weak 1-mana minion. So nothing bad or wrong or terrible about this card. I just don't think it's good enough to make the cut. So now let's move on to a Warlock card that I do think is good enough to make the cut, and perhaps even kind of crazy good. This is called Defile, a new 2-mana spell for Warlock. And this will deal 1 damage to all minions on the board, yours and your opponent's. And if any of those minions die, guess what? You cast Defile again. So it's another Whirlwind effect. And if any of those minions die that time, you cast Defile again. And it's a Whirlwind effect. So essentially, and if you can set up a board state where minions have a cascading health total, in other words, 1 health, 2 health, 3 health, 4 health, you can get Defiles over and over again until you clear the board. So there's a really interesting mechanic here where you're encouraged to trade in really smart ways to set up that cascading health total, that domino effect essentially. You have to maybe waste a Mortal Coil to put a minion down to 3 just to kill that 4 health minion that's up next. Maybe you make a trade that would otherwise not make a lot of sense and sacrifice your own stuff just to make sure you can clear the board. But the potential for this to high roll is kind of silly, because suddenly you have a 2-mana card that could just absolutely destroy everything your opponent has played, making it that really, really cheap Twisting Nether, right? That's absurd. Not to mention that really just a Whirlwind effect for 2 mana isn't the worst thing ever. Whirlwind for Warrior is 1 mana. This is not a normal class that has access to a Whirlwind necessarily, so a little mana penalty is not too bad, and this can go so much higher than just a Whirlwind. It can be a Flame Strike, it can be a Hellfire. It's crazy what this card is capable of when it comes to clearing a board full of minions. And Warlock actually, even though they don't have access to a hero power ping, still probably has a lot of ways to line up health totals and piece together damage, especially with little token minions and stuff, that could really make this powerful, particularly in the early game. But the great thing about a card like this is it's not restricted to the early game. It's also really good in the late game too, even as minion health totals start to climb, because math works that way and you can start to trade in sensible ways that line it up. So I'm a huge fan of the design of this card because it does encourage smart thinking and preemptive trades and things that make people have to really sit down and consider the lines of play and how to match things up perfectly. It's a great design because it reinforces high skill play and thoughtfulness in your turns, which we don't see enough of in Hearthstone, as I've said over and over again. So I like the design, but not only that, I also think it's just a very, very strong card. So now let's move on to another Warlock card here. This time it's the Sanguine Reveler. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with a battle cry, destroy a friendly minion, and gain +2/+2. So, you know, the first thing that comes to mind with this card is what we've seen with Ravenous Terror Dax in Zoo before, where if you destroy, for instance, a Devilsaur Egg, you get a nice little upside on your Terror Dax. You know, you got to adapt a couple times. Here you get +2/+2, so you get a 1-mana 3/3, and you get to kill your Devilsaur Egg to summon a nice little 5/5/2. So the idea here is using this probably in an Egg/Zoo style deck, killing off Possessed Villagers, getting some upside. I like that. It all fits together nicely. I'm still not sure this is that powerful of a card, though, because just compare it to Flame Imp, right? Flame Imp is a guaranteed 3/2 for 1 mana. It's been a staple in Zoo for a long time. This, on the other hand, is sometimes a 3/3, so slightly better than Flame Imp, because we're kind of ignoring the deal 3 damage to your hero, because that has never been particularly relevant in a Zoo's player's mind. They don't really care that much about the health total. So, slightly better than Flame Imp some of the time, but a lot of the time you also have to trade in some kind of resource. So if you use this, for instance, on Possessed Villager, unfortunately you're only really gaining +1/+1 because you had to sacrifice a 1/1 to get 2/2. So you gave up, you know, half of the advantage of your Sanguine Reveler. Now, I mean, sometimes a 3/3 is better than a couple 1/1s, granted, but it's not always in Zoo, and sometimes having that Death Rattle resiliency in Zoo is really important. So, outside of that perfect Dinosaur Egg combo play, I don't know how much I actually like the Sanguine Reveler. I think it's okay, I think it could fit, I think it perhaps will be ran in Zoo decks, but I don't think it's all that crazy strong. I think there's a lot of downsides and a lot of risks. Sometimes it's just going to be a 1-mana 1/1. Obviously not the worst thing ever if you have to play it just as a 1-mana 1/1, but other times you're going to have to destroy something you don't want to destroy if you expect to play this card at all, and that's going to feel really bad. So the battle cry is actually a limitation probably just as much as an upside. So I don't really think this card's going to feel dominant or oppressive or all that good. I think it could be run, but most of the time it won't be that great. So up next is a Paladin minion called the Howling Commander. This is a 3-mana 2/2 with a battle cry that says draw a Divine Shield minion from your deck. So this is basically Paladin's Arcanologist. Instead of for secrets, it's for Tyrian Fordring. But it's not nearly as good as Arcanologist, I would say. First off, because it's a little more expensive and the stats are worse, but also because I'm not really sure the battle cry is that any better than Arcanologist either. With Arcanologist, you thin your deck very successfully because you draw secrets, which are typically things you don't really want to draw because they're often more passive plays. So you thin your deck out so that, you know, you're closer to your Firelands portals, you're closer to your Flame Strikes, you're closer to your Fireballs, those active cards that you really want to draw. With Howling Commander, everybody says you can thin out your deck and find your Tyrian. But the thing about that is you don't really want to thin your deck of Tyrian. You don't mind drawing Tyrian, particularly in the gap between turn 3 and turn 8. If you draw Tyrian on turn 3, it's a long time before you can play it. So you don't mind waiting and taking that chance of drawing your Tyrian. In other words, when you pull Tyrian out of your deck, the average quality of your draws goes down. When you pull a secret out of your deck, the average quality of your draws goes up because you're more likely to get things you want to find. So that obvious, you know, get your Tyrian is not really that big of an upside here in this card as far as I'm concerned. Not to mention that sometimes you draw your Tyrian before you draw your Howling Commander. Now, of course, you can run more than one Divine Shield minion. You can also put in your Wicker Flame Burn Bristle. Maybe you put in a couple Argent Commanders. Whatever, right? There's also clearly a Divine Shield deck on the horizon because Blizzard's really reinforcing that. But if that's the case, if you have a ton of Divine Shield minions, is this really something you'd want to run over Novice Engineer and just have more flexibility because, you know, you're paying 1 extra mana for a couple extra stat points? So I don't really know if the upside is there. I don't think this card is fundamentally bad. Don't get me wrong. It's fine. It could certainly be run. There's nothing broken about it. You know, it's a Cabal Courier that finds you stuff. But when you start to compare this to other 3-drops available to Paladin, do you want to run this over Stonehill Defender? Because frankly, half the time, Stonehill Defender draws you a Tyrian too, but it also leaves your original Tyrian, so you get an extra Tyrian. Or, you know, it gives you your Sunkeeper Tarim or all the other great taunts. So even like Aldor Peacekeeper, there's a lot of solid 3-drops. Rowling Blade, there's all kinds of stuff. You know, Steward of Darkshire is going to be a popular 3-drop, probably in a Divine Shield deck. So how much room is there for Howling Commander? I I think this could show up in a mid-range Paladin deck here or there, but probably not very often just because there are going to be better 3-drop, stronger plays. I don't think this one makes as much sense as some people saw at the very first glance, or at least they assumed at the first glance. So a lot of downside to this card. It's not, again, necessarily bad in and of itself, but within the context of Paladin, within the context of all these other cards, this one does feel considerably worse than those other options. So up next we have a Hunter secret called the Venomstrike Trap. This is a 2-mana secret, and whenever one of your minions is attacked, so much like Snake Trap's condition now, you get to summon a 2/3 Poisonous Cobra. So presumably you're just summoning an Emperor's Cobra. You know, I don't think they're going to create a new card. It's just going to likely be that one. So, you know, once again, another secret that summons you essentially a 3-cost card like Bear Trap, Cat Trick, etc. A lot of 3-mana beasts are now being just added into secrets. So a 1-mana advantage essentially here for your Cobra. Secrets are slightly better at summoning those two because sometimes they leave your opponent without the time or the resources to actually trade into that resource that you've newly summoned, so it often gets to attack right away. So this could be the kind of thing that catches your opponent off guard, gives you a nice little sacrifice of a poisonous minion to trade into something big of theirs. So I like it as a secret. It makes a lot of sense as a secret. It has some thematic relevance, as opposed to a lot of the secrets you feel like, oh, you just didn't really accomplish much. But if you do catch your opponent off guard with this one, it could provide you with some really high swing potential to trade into something cool, and that's exactly how a secret should feel. If they misplay around it, you get to take big advantage of it. So I like the potential there. The problem with this card and basically all the other Hunter Secrets is I just don't know necessarily what kind of deck it fits into right now. Maybe with Professor Putricide, this opens up some more doors for a more mid-rangey / control Hunter that does run some secrets, because it seems like that's the kind of deck Putricide encourages. I think this one fits into it as well, since it becomes sort of a removal type secret instead of just a board value or tempo style secret like we've seen a lot in the past. So maybe it works. I'm not totally against this card. Emperor Cobra is a decent result anyway. It's the kind of card that maybe could almost halfway sort of see playing constructed. Stubborn Gastropod might be even better off the Venomstrike Trap, frankly, but not going to complain. I think this card's alright. It's probably not something you're running constructed a lot, but it probably is something you're fairly happy to see off of Professor Putricide at the very least. So the fact that it exists doesn't necessarily make it a great constructed card, but it's still a good card to exist because of all those other options where you can generate it in hand and add it to the board for free. So I'm glad they put this one in the game. So now we have a Priest spell that I think's really crazy and probably pretty good. This is Eternal Servitude, a 4-mana spell that allows you to discover a friendly minion that died this game, and then you summon that minion. So this is sort of Resurrect or Onyx Bishop, but with some control, because now you actually get to discover the minion. So you get to pick which one you want. So it's not totally RNG based. Once again, great design in that we're not relying on random effects, because in the past, sometimes the Onyx Bishop would roll into Ysera, and sometimes it would roll into Northstar Cleric, and that could have a huge impact on the outcome of the game. Now at least you're going to at least somewhat reliably be able to pick the best cards. You know what to expect with Eternal Servitude. Obviously, it can still low roll sometimes and give you, a Northstar Cleric and a Radiant Elemental and some other junk you don't care about. But more often than not, just based on the odds, as long as you cast this in the late game after some high-quality minions have died, you're going to get to pick some stuff you want to see. And for the record, if you weren't sure, getting a 4-mana Ysera is incredible. That is obscene, and you're going to be able to do it fairly often, like I said. So that's what makes this card really strong. The downside here that I think a lot of people haven't recognized yet, and not enough people are talking about, is how bad this card's going to be often on curve, on turn 4, compared to things like Onyx Bishop was on turn 5. Because if you've only been able to play 3 mana or less minions when you would want to play this on turn 4, if you don't have any other options, then you're not going to have anything good to pick from. You're going to get a 3 mana minion, best case scenario, for a 4 mana card, and that's really bad. So this is the kind of thing that's going to have to sit in your hand towards the mid to late game for it to really make any kind of sense. Unlike a card like Onyx Bishop, which sometimes you were fairly happy to play on turn 5 just as a tempo play. Even if you just got a 1/3, that was still a fairly solid bundle of stats to put on the board on turn 5, because you knew at least some part of the value of the mana cost of Onyx Bishop was built into that 3/4 body that it provided you, so you could never totally fail or never have a totally dead card in hand, which is not the case with Eternal Servitude. So this one's going to be somewhat risky to run. It's going to require the right kind of deck and the right kind of environment. But just the fact that it exists with things like Shadow Visions and those Ysseras and all the other great minions in the game, and the fact that it's something you can get off of Lyra, for instance, all of those are really important to Priest. It just gives them more tools and more options. And I think this is a solid card. When it works really well, it's stupid good. But unfortunately, it does have some major downsides. So it's not, to me, like a perfect 5-star card like a lot of people are saying it might be. I think it's a little bit less than that, although still a solid option for Priest. So up next is a Druid card that does seem really, really good to me. This one's called Spreading Plague. It's a new 5-mana spell for Druid, and it allows you to summon a 1/5 Scarab with Taunt. So right off the bat, you get at least a 1/5, but if your opponent has more minions, after you've summoned that minion, you get to cast it again, just like Defile we saw with Warlock. This basically has some sort of condition where the spell can keep chaining over and over again. So if your opponent has 4 minions, and you have 0 minions, and you cast this, you're going to get 4 1/5 taunts. And that is crazy good for 5 mana. As far as the math here is concerned, essentially, right, if you think about a card like Silverback Patriarch, obviously a terrible card, but the sort of vanilla classic representation of mana for stats and for effect. That's a 1/4 taunt that costs 3 mana. Really, it should really be about 2.5 if we're really saying things. Maybe even 2 mana. That would make it a playable card, perhaps, right? So each of these 1/5 Scarabs you get is probably worth 3 mana, at least 3 mana. A 1/5 taunt would be about 3 mana. Mogashan Warden's a 1/7 taunt for 4 mana. So 3 mana is about where it lines up. So as soon as you get 2 of these, you're looking at a mana efficient play. You're not looking at a strong play, because that wouldn't be a game deciding play, getting 2 average 3-drops for their expected cost. But that's where it starts to break even. As you get to 3, as you get to 4, as you get to 5, the value starts to go off the charts. Of course, 1/5 taunts by themselves, even if you have 5 of them, aren't going to win you any games. They're eventually just going to die. They don't apply enough pressure. They don't do enough damage. But they stall incredibly well. 5 health is an annoying amount of health to deal with. So if your opponent has a bunch of small stuff, token decks, bunch of 1/1s, bunch of 1/2s, bunch of totems, whatever it might be, you're getting a lot of stats out onto the board. You're getting a lot of annoyance, a lot of stuff to just slow down your opponent and buy you time to make really big plays alongside of it. So I think this is a very usable tool for Druid. I think a lot of different slow Druid decks could make this work, because there's always those games in Druid where your opponent just plays a ton of stuff, a flood of minions. You don't have swipe necessarily, but a lot of it's 2 health, so the swipe doesn't even help you if you do. And you're desperately looking for some way to stabilize, just to buy yourself a couple turns, because Druid's never had a lot of good board clears for dealing with medium-sized things. This starts to serve as a pseudo board stop, a stall effect, where if they go super wide against you, you have that answer. You can play 5 1/5s all of a sudden for 5 mana, slow them down, find the wraths, find the swipes, establish more taunts, continue to ramp up, get to the late game where you can start to assert your dominance as Druid. I actually even think this has a little bit of potential, perhaps in a token deck, or a deck that runs things like Savage Roars, or just a handful of buffs like Wisps of the Old Gods, for instance. If you can combo this out with even a Mark of the Lotus, having 4 or 5 2/6 taunts is really crazy good. So maybe this is something you Tekka one of in as a sort of living mana style card, where if you fall behind in the early game as a token Druid, this gives you a really wide board to build off of that's hard for your opponent to address, and allows you to find the buffs and the time to pressure them back. I should also probably talk a little bit about the fact that this card's really only good when you're behind. In other words, if you have a couple minions on the board already, due to the wording of this, it basically every minion you have reduces the amount of minions you summon with Spreading Plague. But in the decks I envision this in, which are really late game control Druids, if you already have a couple minions on the board and your opponent only has a couple minions on the board, you're already winning the game. So you don't need Spreading Plague. This is there for those instances where you're behind and you're trying to stabilize. It's not there as a pressure applier. So it's okay if it becomes a dead card when you're winning. You don't need a win more card. You need a safety and stabilization card in those kinds of decks. So I think it still suits the need. And even if you do have a minion or two out there, if your opponent goes wide with 4 or 5, if you summon, just a couple bodies off of Spreading Plague once you've already stabilized, that's totally fine. They're still going to get in the way. They're still going to slow down your opponent and allow you even more time to assert your dominance with your giant minions and your big resources. So it still fits perfectly, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a very strong card for Druid. And here we have another good card. This time it's for Rogue, and it's called the Shadowblade. It's a 3-mana weapon. It's a 3 attack and 2 durability weapon, and it has a cool little battle cry. Your hero is immune this turn. So once again, Rogue getting tools to make them take less damage while utilizing their weapons. So this battle cry is great. It basically gives you a free trade the turn you play this where you just don't take damage. So maybe it's a little 2 health gain, a 4 health gain, maybe sometimes even a little bit bigger. But on average, I'd say probably 3 to 4 health gained from this battle cry. Which, don't minimize that. That's nice. That's a free little holy light sometimes. That's great. That can make the difference between being able to stabilize and not being able to stabilize in Rogue. That can keep you alive against a mage with that fireball in hand. So that's a great battle cry. It also has some additional resources. They mentioned Leper Gnome on the reveal stream. Leper Gnome can't hurt you if you kill it with Shadowblade. Explosive Trap. There's all kinds of interactions there. So this can save you even more health than the trade itself. But I don't even really care about the battle cry that much. To me, this is just a 3-mana, 3/2 weapon. And we know from things like Rallying Blade, of course, Fiery War Axe, that 3/2 is a magic number for weapons. Any weapon that's 3/2 is probably playable. Even if you don't get to utilize the weapon upside from Rallying Blade, you're usually still happy to play it just as a expensive Fiery War Axe. Eaglehorn Bow, same story. It's run all the time, even without Secret Synergy. And Shadowblade fits into that same space. It's a 3/2 weapon. That's really good. There's some upside here. It's great to build upon with Deadly Poison, so on and so forth. But even as just a 3/2, it's probably still the kind of card Rogue could run. Now, I'm not saying it fits perfectly well into the ways we envision Rogue today. There might be better options for different Rogue decks like Obsidian Blade, some Rogue decks like Miracle. Probably don't need to run a weapon like this. But the fact that this exists for Rogue does open up more options for more of a weapon-based version of Rogue, tempo-based versions of Rogue. So I like this card. It creates a lot more space for Rogue to operate in as far as weapons are concerned. Now this does still go counter to Rogue's hero power. If you're running weapons, your hero power loses a lot of utility. But I'm assuming that with the Rogue Death Knight hero card, with the swapped hero power, it probably won't be weapon-based, so that cards like this have even more space in which to operate and make a lot of sense in that deck. So regardless, I still think Shadowblade's a strong card. It can be played in a lot of different decks and make sense in a lot of different environments, but it probably gets even better if those synergies do open up. So keep a really close eye on this one, because I think this is a solid addition to Rogue's arsenal. And then finally, I have one last card. It is the Snowflipper Penguin. It is essentially this expansion's Wisp. 0 mana, 1/1, but this time it's a beast. It's the Murloc Tiny Fin, I guess, is the more accurate assessment, because it's got a tribal affiliation, much like the Murloc Tiny Fin. This is not a card that's going to be run and constructed. It's not going to be very good in Arena either. I think this is really here for those Jeweled Macaw situations. It's here for Build a Beast. It's just one of those filler cards. It's mostly meant as a super cute meme card, a nod to the community, although this is a cute penguin, but it's not as cute as Murloc Tiny Fin or some of the other cute cards we've seen in the past. So not a lot to say about this one. Clearly a very, very weak card that's more about just taking up a spot for all these different summoning effects, and a spot, frankly, in your collection book as well than it is as an actual considerable playable card. And there you go, guys. That's it for my detailed reviews of each of these cards. I probably went on a little bit too long there. I had a lot to say because there were so many different cards. But some pretty good ones this time around. Some really exciting design space being opened up, and some really interesting effects. So I can't wait to actually see these in action. But now I would really like to jump into my quick reviews to give each of these cards a rating from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and rank all these bad boys. Starting off with Prince Valanar, this is a 1-star card. Moorabi is a 3-star card. Cryostasis is a 3-star card. Frostless Jana is a 1-star card. Doomed Apprentice is a 1-star card. Dead Man's Hand is a 4-star card. Animated Berserker is a 2-star card. Defile is a 5-star card. That's my first 5-star rating, but I think this one's really, really good. Sanguine Reveler is a 2-star card. Howling Commander is a 2-star card. Venomstrike Trap is a 2-star card. Eternal Servitude is a 4-star card. Spreading Plague is a 4-star card, although I thought about giving this one 5. I had to keep it at 4 for now. Shadowblade is another 4-star card, and then the Snowflipper Penguin is a 1-star card. So there you go, guys. Actually, some pretty solid ratings this time around. Handful of 3s, a handful of 4s, couple 1s as well, but that's always going to be the case in every expansion. Just because they say a card is 1 stars, it doesn't mean I hate it. It doesn't mean I'm never going to play it. I'm still going to have fun with these cards. I'm still going to experiment. I just don't think they're going to be very influential in the meta. And if you look back historically throughout expansions in Hearthstone's history, most legendary cards and most cards don't really get played that much. We're a little bit biased from Journey to Un'Goro, where a lot of cards have seen play, but remember, only one quest gets played from Journey to Un'Goro in the actual competitive meta. So it wouldn't be surprising if 8 out of 9 of those legendaries failed. A lot of the legendaries from Knights of the Frozen Throne will fail too, and that's okay. Some of them just have to have 1 and 2-star ratings. So don't hate me. I'm not anti-fun. I'm not a Debbie Downer on the expansion. I think it's going to be awesome. Just we're still waiting for some of the really strong cards to show up, I think. Not to mention, of course, the fact that I can always be wrong. And that's what I want to hear. If you guys think I'm wrong, let me know in the comments below. I always love to read your take on all these cards. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.